She laughed at his sandals, mocked his dusty shop, and told her friends that no woman should ever marry a man who fixes shoes for a living. Years later, the same girl, dressed in worn-out clothes and carrying a baby on her back, stood outside his luxury gate, begging for help from the very shoemaker she once humiliated. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about growth, patience, and how destiny can turn the tables when you least expect it. Asterisk, if you believe in karma, in second chances, and in the kind of stories that tug at your soul, hit that subscribe button now. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. We're telling real African tales by Ha, and your village might be next. Asterisk, in a small sun-scorched village, nestled between the high red hills of Anato, in West Africa, lived a young man named Mumo, known across the entire region as Mumo wa Virtu, the shoemaker of souls. Mumo was not just any cobbler. He was a boy raised by silence, forged by poverty, and gifted with hands that could bring even the most broken soul back to life. He lived in a tiny clay hut with his blind grandmother, Mama Sarah, whose stories of forgotten kings and betrayed warriors taught Mumo more about the world than any school ever could. Every morning Mumo sat cross-legged under the shade of a giant neem tree at the edge of the market square, surrounded by old leather, broken shoes, and children who came to watch him work like he was performing magic. His hands stitched faster than gossip could spread, his eyes rarely looked up, and his ears always open. He heard laughter, mockery, secrets, and pain from the villagers who thought he was invisible. But Mumo heard it all, and among the loudest voices was the one that cut deepest, the voice of Naledi. Naledi was the village princess, not by blood but by wealth and attitude. Her father owned half the buses in the district. Her mother ran the largest fabric stall in the central market, and Naledi walked like the ground owed her an apology. She wore imported dresses, her phone played loud music none of us understood, and her braids sparkled like stars under the African sun. Everyone loved Naledi, and Naledi loved no one, especially not Mumo. Why is he always there? She once asked, loud enough for all to hear, pointing her freshly manicured nail at Mumo. Doesn't he know that shoes don't make men? Her friends cackled like firewood, and Mumo just smiled, not because he wasn't hurt, but because he had already learned that even the smallest stitch can repair what's torn, given enough time. But fate, you see, does not sleep, and the wheel of time turns, whether rich girls laugh or not. Mumo kept fixing shoes, day after day, season after season, even when his grandmother died, even when the rain swept away his hut, even when the chief refused to give him a market license because shoemaking isn't a profession. Mumo did not stop. He fixed sandals for children, heels for mothers, and boots for soldiers. One day, a stranger came to town, a businesswoman named Auntie Nafula, who owned several tailoring shops across the region. Her shoe had snapped. Mumo fixed it in 10 minutes. She offered him a job in the city. He said no. Then let me invest in you, she said. You don't belong under a tree. With her help, Mumo moved to town, opened a shop made of glass and stone, hired other young cobblers, taught them the art he had mastered. Within 3 years, Mumo's shoes opened 5 branches across the district. His face was on flyers. His shop was in newspapers. But Mumo, he still stitched by hand, quietly, precisely, like he was still under that neem tree. Until one Sunday afternoon, when a knock came at his compound gate. A woman in a headscarf, dusty feet, torn wrapper, and a baby, clinging to her chest stood there. The guards almost chased her away, until Mumo stepped out. He knew that voice, that face, even if her glow was gone and her smile was broken. It was Naledi, the same girl who once laughed at his dusty hands. Momo didn't speak at first. His silence was thicker than the Harmattan fog. Naledi avoided his gaze, rocking her child slowly like motion alone could wipe her past clean. I didn't know where else to go, she finally whispered, and Mumo, whose voice could be gentler than stitched suede, or sharper than a broken heel. Said nothing as he studied her, this woman, who once had crowds around her, who now stood alone, whose bracelets had been replaced with bruises, and whose perfume had been swallowed by struggle. He stepped aside and let her in. Inside his compound, everything smelled of freshly polished leather and roasted maize from the corner vendor. She looked around, perhaps expecting to be mocked, but Mumo simply gestured to the bench and asked, "The child, is he hungry?" That question, simple as it was, broke Naledi. She cried, covering her face with her free hand, while her baby clung tighter. Through cracked sobs, she told him everything. How she married a man from the city who wore suits like armor but raised fists like thunder. How he had promised her wealth, only to lock her away in it. How her father lost all his buses to debt, and her mother fled to another town to escape shame. How she came back to the village, not as a queen, but as a ghost. She didn't want pity, she wanted peace, a roof, and a way to feed her son. And all the people she once praised had closed their doors, all but the one she mocked. Mumo called his cook to prepare food. Then, he gave her his late grandmother's room and a warm towel. Not once did he mention the past. But that night, as the rain tapped on the zinc roof and thunder rolled in the distance like ancestral drums, Naledi stared at the ceiling and remembered all the times she walked past that neem tree. How she tossed coins at him like a king tossing scraps. How she laughed with her friends about his broken stool. How she once said, "A man with dirty shoes can never walk into my life." And yet, here she was, barefoot in his home, with her future resting in his hands. The next morning Mumo spoke little, but his actions screamed. He enrolled her child in a nearby daycare. He helped her enroll in a tailoring course run by one of his friends. And every day, he handed her a journal. "Write," he said. "Tell your story. Someone will need it someday." Naledi didn't understand at first, but she obeyed. The weeks turned to months. Her son began to laugh again. She began to stitch again. Her face grew rounder, her eyes clearer, her voice stronger. And through it all, Mumo stayed the same, never boastful, never bitter. He taught her about balance, about work, about why every seam mattered. And when he finally opened a women's shoemaking branch and named her manager, Naledi cried again. Not from sadness this time, but from something rare, redemption. Gossip, of course, ran like wildfire through the village. Some said Mumo had bewitched her. Others said she was finally paying for her arrogance. But those who watched closely saw the truth. That growth, unlike gossip, is quiet. Mumo and Naledi became unlikely partners, not lovers, not at first. Just two souls who had both walked through fire and come out softer. They organized free shoemaking workshops for orphans. They hosted village forums about abuse and forgiveness. And when Naledi's ex-husband came back, one day arrogant, loud, and drunk, Mumo faced him, not with fists but with facts. A restraining order, a lawyer, and a community ready to protect one of their own. Naledi finally stood her ground. The man left that same day, but not before asking Mumo, "Why would you help a woman who humiliated you?" Mumo smiled and said, "Because she reminded me of who I used to be before. Someone believed in me, and that was the truth." Mama Sarah, his late grandmother, once told him that every broken soul can become whole again, but only if someone believes it's worth stitching. Seasons passed, and with them came a shift in the village, both in air and attitude. Naledi, once the laughingstock of whispered conversations, now became a figure of inspiration. She wore her past like an old scar, visible but healed, and her work at the shoemaking branch transformed from mere employment to something closer to ministry. Young girls would come, wide-eyed and barefoot, and she'd hand them thread and needles, telling them gently, "You don't need shoes to start, just the will to walk." Mumo, too, flourished. His name became known far beyond the village. He was invited to urban conferences, spoken about on the radio, called the cobbler philosopher for the way he wove wisdom into leather. But he always returned home, always chose his modest shop, with its rusted sign and neem tree over boardrooms and billboards. And when Naledi, 3 years after arriving at his doorstep, asked to buy her own land to build a home, he gifted her the very plot she once said was too dusty for a lady like me. There, she built not just a house, but a haven one with a garden, an open workshop, and a room for other women escaping silent battles. They called it the House of Second Chances. The story might have ended there with success, redemption, and silent forgiveness. But life, like thread, loops back in surprising ways. One rainy evening, during a village celebration, Mumo was honored for his contributions. As drums thumped and lanterns flickered in the dusk, the chief handed him a carved shoe, symbol of progress. Naledi was beside him, radiant in a dress she'd sewn herself. As they sat together, smiling at the children dancing in the rain, a little girl, barefoot and shivering, approached. She said nothing, just looked at Naledi's shoes. With longing, without hesitation, Naledi slipped them off and handed them to her. "These were once given to me," she said. "Now they're yours." Mumo turned to her, his eyes soft, voice low. "You've become the woman you once feared you'd never be." She nodded, eyes damp, whispering back, "Because you became the man I never deserved." That night, they didn't speak of love, but something deeper settled between the man, unspoken truth, braided through shared history. A month later, under the shade of the Nim tree, where everything began, they hosted a wedding not theirs, but for a girl Naledi once mentored, and the boy she met during a shoemaking class. Mumo repaired the groom's torn sandal himself, humming a lullaby Mama Siro used to sing. As the ceremony ended, Naledi leaned toward him and finally asked, "What would you say if I asked you to walk with me, not just through this village, but through whatever comes next?" Mumo didn't respond with poetry or promises. He simply stood, offered her his hand, and said, "Let's take it one step at a time." They walked away from the crowd, to silhouettes against the sunset, no longer a shoemaker and a spoiled girl, but partners molded by grace, stitched by hardship, and polished by time. And somewhere in that village, a child laughed while learning to sew. A woman wept as she slipped on her first pair of hand-stitched sandals, and the neem treacle, rooted and resilient, watched over them all, whispering the quiet truth to anyone who paused to listen, that sometimes rejection is just the beginning of a story worth telling.